Achan, Ai, and the Valley of Achor, the consequences of coveting, consequences of making a covenant without asking God. And Jesus faces Pilate, faces Herod, takes the place of Barabbas, is crucified, dies, and is buried. Today on 3 in 1, as we consider Joshua chapter 7 through 9 and Luke chapter 22. Matthew 7 verse 11 says, "If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask Him?" God wants to give good gifts. And sometimes we want things so bad before, or rather without even asking Him, that we take them instead, figuring it would be easier to ask for forgiveness rather than for permission. But the problem is there are consequences to coveting. Like we saw today, when you take something without asking and hide it, the consequences can go way beyond gut rot. Like we saw today with Achan, Ai, and the Valley of Achor. Achor means trouble. Achan was in trouble because he took something that was not his to take, and he hid it in his tent. After winning a battle, he wanted to take some of the spoils, but God had said no. Tragically, Achan did not know that this no was really a not yet. For we read in the next chapter, after Achan was disciplined for his coveting and concealing, that God was going to give them the spoils of the next battle. If he would have only waited, if he would have only asked God. Now, what do you want? Has it gone beyond wanting and into coveting? Have you asked God about it? He's a good dad, and he knows how to give good gifts. And even if he says no now, it may be a not yet, if what you're asking for is a good gift. It just may not be time yet. Trust Him on the timing and not your own selfish desires. He is not withholding anything good from you. He only wants what's best for you. Whatever you want apart from His will is not worth sacrificing your fellowship with God. So wait on God, ask God, and obey God. Who knows? If what you're asking for is good, you actually ask God, He may surprise you and say, "I thought you never ask." Sometimes you have not because you ask not. So, tragically, Achan died in the Valley of Achor, and Ai was eventually defeated after Israel dealt with their sin within. And in tragic irony, after all of this, God said, "You can take the spoils from the battle of Ai." Bummer. Best to always wait on God. Best to always ask God. Best to always obey God, trusting that He is always a good God that knows how to give good gifts. Okay, on to Joshua chapter 9, where we saw the consequences once again of doing something without asking God first. This time, it was not the consequences of coveting. It was rather the consequences of making a covenant. Now, you may be tempted to say, they were tricked. The Gibeonites were rather convincing in their ruse with worn-out clothes and moldy bread, but either way, we walk by faith, not by sight, and it's best always to ask God, to ask the one who has all the information in every situation. Well, Joshua led Israel to make a covenant with the Gibeonites without asking God, and after they found out, they were upset, but they still kept their word, they still kept their covenant, with one caveat. The Gibeonites would become slaves, woodcutters and water carriers for the house of God. They would work so that others could worship. Now, I can't help but wonder if there was grace as well as mercy in that punishment. Woodcutters and water carriers in the house of God, working behind the scenes so that others could simply come and worship, I wonder. Well, on to our New Testament reading for today, Luke chapter 22. The chapter begins with Jesus facing Pontius Pilate, who asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him and said, "It is as you say." Then Pilate went on to say, "I find no fault in this man." Not wanting to be involved in this controversy, Pilate passed Jesus on to Herod, who saw Jesus as a sideshow circus act. And when Jesus refused to dance, Herod mocked him, dressed him up like a king, and sent him back to Pilate. Now, still trying to avoid condemning an innocent man, Pilate tried to appeal to the custom of releasing a prisoner at Passover. but the people asked for Barabbas to be released instead. Now, I wonder what it was like for the rebellious murderer to walk by innocence in Jesus as he heard the crowds shout, "Crucify." Barabbas, before any other, would realize that Jesus died in his place, mocked, beaten, tried, and crucified. And yet even from the cross, Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." Now, how much restraint would it take to take all of that, knowing that you were dying for the very sins that they were committing in mocking you and beating you and crucifying you? And yet we know that it was his love, his great love for us, for me, for you, that kept his mouth closed, that kept him up on that cross until everything was accomplished. And when everything was accomplished, when our collective penalties had been fully paid, Jesus cried from the cross with a loud voice, "Totelestai," which means paid in full. And then he said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And he died. The author of life died, fully dead, fully buried in a borrowed tomb, offered up by Joseph of Arimathea. Now, Joseph did not know that the tomb would only be borrowed, but Jesus did, and he tried to tell his disciples many times. The third day is coming, Resurrection Sunday. Resurrection Sunday after Good Friday, when death was defeated